A bill that would eliminate countywide polling locations has passed its first committee vote. Countywide polling means people can cast a ballot at any location regardless of precinct. As KLTV7's Kristine Guevara reports, if passed, this new bill would restrict voting locations to the voter's precinct.
Senate Bill 990 was written by District 2 Republican State Senator Bob Hall, who says the bill would fix the issues that he says countywide polling presents.
Some election workers have expressed concern that countywide voting increases vulnerabilities in election securities and frustrates a chain of custody measures. It is an unnecessary convenience that sacrifices election security.
Self-described conservative watchdog Jack Finger of San Antonio is in favor of the bill because of election integrity concerns.
The electronic fraud can make a 60% winner look like a 40% loser. I don't like that.
But Amber Mill with Move Texas Action Fund says location inconvenience would occur.
For others, such as those who work late, early in the morning, or multiple jobs, countywide voting offers more flexibility within limited voting hours to be able to make a plan to vote based on where they will be and when.
Gregg County and Smith County have countywide polling. Jennifer Briggs with the Gregg County Elections Office talked about the effects of the bill if it passes.
It would change the whole process. We'd have to open up more polling places. We'd have to have more workers. We'd have to have more equipment. It'd be more of an expense on the taxpayers because we would have to pay more money for those type of things.
Smith County Election Administrator Michelle Alcon also shared her concerns.
If you were narrowing their polling places to just a single polling place, it would make it much more difficult for those individuals to actually vote.
Kristine Guevara, KLTV 7 News.
And it's not clear when this bill will hit the Senate floor for debate there.